Welcome back to your next chapter in the History of Protestantism by James A. Wiley. I'm Nicholas Arthur, and you are listening to Prophecy Reformation Now. Because God-given prophecy is history in advance, it is very important for the Christian to learn about the history of the church that Jesus said he would build, starting about 2,000 years ago when he said, "I will build my church." Only if we truly understand history can we find our place in the prophecy of the Revelation, and perhaps even come to know what must shortly come to pass in our own time as well. So, let us pick up right where we left off last time.
Chapter 6. Calvin, His Birth and Education. Greater champions about to appear. Calvin, his birth and lineage, his appearance and disposition, his education, appointed to chaplaincy, the Black Death, sent to La Marche at Paris, Matherin Cordier, friendship between the young pupil and his student, Calvin charmed by the great Latin writers, Luther's and Calvin's services to their respective tongues, leaves the school of La Marche. The young vine just planted in France was bending before the tempest, and seemed on the point of being uprooted. The enemies of the gospel, who, pending the absence of the king, still a prisoner at Madrid, had assumed the direction of the affairs, did as it pleased them. Beda and Duprat, whom fear had made cruel, were planting stake after stake, and soon there would remain not one confessor to tell that the gospel had ever entered the kingdom of France. The Reformation, which as yet had hardly commenced its career, was already as good as burned out. But those who so reasoned overlooked the power of him who can raise up living witnesses from the ashes of dead ones. The men whom Beda had burned filled a comparatively narrow sphere, and were possessed of but humble powers. Mightier champions were about to step upon the stage, whom God would so fortify by his Spirit, and so protect by his providence, that all the power of France should not prevail against them. And from the midst of the scaffolds and blazing stakes with which its enemies had encompassed it, Protestantism would come forth to fill Christendom with disciples and the world with light. The great leader of the Reformation in Germany stepped at once upon the scene. No note sounded his advent, and no herald ushered him upon the stage. From the seclusion of his monastery at Erfurt came Luther, startling the world by the suddenness of his appearing, and the authority with which he spoke. But the coming of the great reformer of France was gradual. If Luther rose on men like a star that blazes suddenly forth in the dark sky, Calvin's coming was like that of day, sweetly and softly opening on the mountain-tops, streaking the horizon with its silver, and steadily waxing in brightness till at last the whole heavens are filled with the splendor of its light. Calvin, whose birth and education we are now briefly to trace, was born in humble condition, like most of those who have accomplished great things for God in the world. He first saw the light on the 10th of July, 1509, at Noyon in Picardy. His family was of Norman extraction. His grandfather was still living in the small town of Pont-l'Evêque, and was a cooper by trade. His father, Gerard, was apostolic notary and secretary to the bishop, through whom he hoped one day to find for his son John preferment in the church, to which, influenced doubtless by the evident bent of his genius, he had destined him. Yes, higher than his father's highest dream was the Noyon boy to rise in the church, but in a more Catholic church than the Roman. Let us sketch the young Calvin. We have before us a boy of about 10 years old. He is of delicate mold, small stature, with pale features, and a bright burning eye indicating a soul deeply penetrative as well as richly emotional. There hangs about him an air of timidity and shyness, and not infrequent accompaniment of a mind of great sensibility and power lodged in a fragile bodily organization. He is thoughtful beyond his years, devout, too, up to the standard of the Roman Church, and beyond it, he is punctual as stroke of clock in his religious observances, nor is it a mere mechanical devotion which he practices. The soul that looks forth at those eyes can go mechanically about nothing. As regards his morals, he has been a Nazarite from his youth up. No stain of outward vice has touched him. This made the young Calvin a mystery in a sort to his companions. By the beauty of his life, if not by words, he became their unconscious reproof. From his paternal home, the young Calvin passed to the stately mansion of the Mormers, the lords of the neighborhood. The hour they saw Calvin cross this noble threshold was not an uneventful one to him. He was not much at home in the stately halls that now opened to receive him, and often, he tells us, he was fain to hide in some shady corner from the observation of the brilliant company that filled them. But the discipline he here underwent was a needful preparation for his life's work. Educated with the young Mormers, but at his father's cost, he received a more thorough classical grounding, and acquired a polish of manners to which he must have ever remained a stranger had he grown up under his father's humble roof. He who had to be the counselor of princes, a master in the schools, and a legislator in the church must needs have an education neither superficial nor narrow. The young Calvin mastered with wonderful ease what it cost his class fellows much labor and time to acquire. His knowledge seemed to come by intuition. While yet a child, he loved to pray in the open air, thus giving proof of expansiveness of soul. The age could not think of God but as dwelling in temples made with hands. Calvin sublimely realized him as one whose presence fills the temple of the universe. In this he resembles the young Anselm, who, lifting his eyes to the grand mountains that guard his native valley of Aosta, believed that if he could climb to their summit, he would be nearer him who has placed his throne in the sky. At this time, the chaplaincy of a small church in the neighborhood, termed La Jessine, fell vacant, and Gerard Chauvin, finding the expense of his son's education too much for him, solicited and obtained, 1521, from the bishop the appointment for his son John. Calvin was then only 12 years of age, but it was the manner of the times for even younger persons to hold ecclesiastical offices of still higher grade. To have the bishop's crozier or cardinal's hat before they were well able to understand what these dignities meant. The young chaplain of Gessine had his head solemnly shorn by the bishop on the eve of Corpus Christi, and although not yet admitted into the priest's orders, he became by the symbolic act a member of the clergy, and a servant of that church of which he was to become, in later life without exception, the most powerful opponent, and foe of whom all the others she dreaded the most. 2 years more did the young chaplain of La Jessine continue to reside in his native town of Noyon, holding his title but discharging no duties. For what functions could a child of 12 years perform? Now came the Black Death to Noyon. The pestilence, a dreadful one, caused great terror in the place. Many of the inhabitants had already been carried off by it, and the canons petitioned the chapter for leave to live elsewhere during its ravages. Gerard Chauvin, trembling for the safety of his son, the hope of his life, also petitioned the chapter to give the young chaplain liberty to go wherever he pleased without loss of his allowance. The records of the chapter show, according to the Vicar General Desmay and the Canon Levasseur, that this permission was granted in August 1523. The young Mormars were about to proceed to Paris to prosecute their studies, and Gerard Chauvin was but too glad of the opportunity of sending a son along with his fellow students and comrades to study in the capital. At the age of 14, the future reformer quitted his father's house. Flying from one pestilence, says his Romish historians, he caught another. At Paris, Calvin entered the school or College of La Marche. There was at that time in this college a very remarkable man, Mathurin Cordier, who was renowned for his exquisite taste, his pure Latinity, and his extensive education. These accomplishments might have opened to Cordier a path to brilliant advancement, but he was one of those who prefer pursuing their own tastes and retaining their independence to occupying a position where they should, to some extent, have to sacrifice both. He devoted his whole life to the teaching of youth, and his fame has come down to our own days in connection with one of his books still used in some schools under the title of Cordier's Colloquies. One day, Mathurin Cordier saw a scholar about 14 years of age, fresh from the country, enter his school. His figure was slender, his features were sallow, but his eye lent such intelligence and beauty to his face that the teacher could not help remarking him. Cordier soon saw that he had a pupil of no ordinary genius before him, and after the first few days the scholar of 14 and the man of 50 became inseparable. At the hour of school dismissals, it was not the playground, but his loving, genial instructor, who grew young again in the society of his pupil, that Calvin sought. Such was the great teacher whom God had provided for the yet greater scholar. Mathurin Cordier was not the mere linguist. His mind was fraught with the wisdom of the ancients. The highest wisdom, it is true, he could not impart, for both master and pupil were still immersed in the darkness of superstition. But the master of La Marche initiated his pupil into the spirit of the Renaissance, which, like a balmy spring, was chasing away the winter of the Middle Ages, and freshening the world with the rich verdure and attractive blossoms of ancient civilization. The severe yet copious diction of Cicero, the lofty thoughts and deep wisdom of this and other great masters of Roman literature, the young Calvin soon learned to appreciate and to admire. He saw that if he aspired to wield influence over his fellow men, he must first of all perfect himself in the use of that mighty instrument by which access is gained to the heart and its deep fountains of feeling and its powerful springs of action touched and set in motion. Language, namely, and especially written language. From this hour the young student began to graft upon his native tongue of France those graces of style, those felicities of expression, that flexibility, terseness, and fire which should fit it for expressing with equal ease the most delicate shade of sentiment or the most powerful burst of feeling. It is remarkable, surely, that the two great reformers of Europe should have been each the creator of the language of his native country. Calvin was the father of the French language, as Luther was the father of the German. There had been a language in these countries, doubtless, since the days of their first savage inhabitants, a French and a German, before there was a Calvin and a Luther, just as there was a steam engine before James Watt. But it is not truer that Watt was the inventor of the steam engine by making it a really useful instrument, that it is true that Luther and Calvin were the creators of their respective tongues, as now spoken and written. Calvin found French, as Luther had found German, a coarse, meager speech of narrow compass, a small adaptability, and the vehicle of only low ideas. He breathed into it a new life, a vastly wider compass, and infinitely finer flexibility did he give it, and moreover he elevated and sanctified it by pouring into it the treasures of the gospel, thereby enriching it with a multitude of new terms and subliming it with the energies of a celestial fire. The transformation in the tongue of France, the reformer achieved by the new thinking and feeling he taught his countrymen, for language is simply the outcome of the life of the people by whom it is spoken. Under a lean and attenuated body, says one of his enemies, he displayed already a lively and vigorous spirit, prompt at repartee, both to attack a great faster, either on account of his health, and to stop the fumes of his headache which assaulted him continually, or to have his mind freer for writing, studying, and improving his memory. He spoke but little, but his words were always full of gravity, and never missed their aim. He was never seen in company, but always in retirement. How unlike the poetic halo that surrounds the youth of Luther! But, asked Bungener, is there but one style of poetry, and is there no poetry in the steady pursuit of the good and true all through the age of pleasure, illusion, and disorder? That Calvin was the father of French Protestantism is, of course, admitted by all, but we less often hear it acknowledged that he was the father of French literature. Yet this service, surely a great one, ought not to be passed over in silence. It is hard to say how much the illustrious statesmen and philosophers, the brilliant historians and poets who came after him, owed to him. They found in the language, which he had so largely helped to make fit for their use, a suitable vehicle for the talent and genius by which they made themselves and their country famous. Their wit, their sublimity, and their wisdom would have been smothered in the opaque, undramatic, poverty-stricken, and inharmonious phraseology to which they would have been forced to consign them. Than language there is no more powerful instrumentality for civilizing men, and there is no more powerful instrumentality for fashioning language than the gospel. Luther, says Bousset, triumphed orally, but the pen of Calvin is the more correct. Both excelled in speaking the language of their country. To Calvin, says Etienne Pasquier, our tongue is greatly indebted. No one of those who preceded him excelled him in writing well, says Ramond, and few since have approached him in beauty and felicity of language. Calvin fulfilled his course under Cordier, and in 1526 he passed into the College of Montaigu, one of the two seminaries in Paris, the Sorbonne being the other, for the training of priests. His affection for his old master of Lamarche and his sense of benefit received from him, the future reformer carried with him to the new college, nay, to the grave. In later years he dedicated to him his commentary on the first epistle to the Thessalonians. In doing so, he takes occasion to attribute to the lessons of Cordier all the progress he had made in the higher branches of study, and, if posterity, he says, derives any fruit from his works, he would have it known that it is indebted for it, in part at least, to Cordier. Chapter 7. Calvin's Conversion. Calvin in the Montaigu. His devotions and studies. Prognostication of his teachers. Calvin still in darkness. Trebly armed. Olive-tanned. Discussions between Olive-tan and Calvin. Doubts awakened. Great struggles of soul. The priests advise him to confess. Olive-tan sends him to the Bible. Opens the book. Sees the cross. Another obstacle. The church. sees the spiritual glory of the true church. The glory of the false church vanishes. One of the greatest battles of the world. Victory and its fruits. On crossing the threshold of La Montague, Calvin felt himself in a new but not a better atmosphere, unlike that of La Marche, which was sunny with the free ideas of Republican Rome. The air of Montague was musty with the dogmas of the schoolmen, but as yet Calvin could breathe that air. The student with the pale face and the grave and serious deportment did not fail to satisfy the most scholastic and church of the professors at whose feet he now sat. His place was never empty at Mass. No fast did he ever profane by tasting forbidden dish, and no saint did he ever affront by failing to do honor to his or her fete day. The young student was not more punctual in his devotions than diligent in his studies. So ardent was he in the pursuit of knowledge that often the hours of meal passed without his eating. Long after others were locked in sleep, he was still awake. He would keep poring over the page of Schoolmen or Father till far into the morning. The inhabitants of that quarter of Paris were wont to watch a tiny ray that might be seen streaming from a certain window of a certain chamber. Calvin's, of the college after every other light had been extinguished, and long after the midnight hour had passed, his teachers formed the highest hopes of him. A youth of so fine parts, of an industry so unflagging, and who was withal so pious, was sure, they said, to rise high in the church. They prognosticated for him no mere country curacy or rectorship, no mere city diocese. Nothing less was in store for such a scholar than the purple of a cardinal. He who was now the pride of their college was sure in time to become one of the lights of Christendom. Yes, one of the lights of Christendom. The student with the pale face and with the burning eye was fated to become. Wide around was his light to beam, nor was it the nations of Europe only, sitting meanwhile in the shadow of Rome, that Calvin was to enlighten, but tribes and peoples far off, inhabiting islands and continents which no eye of explorer had yet discovered, and no keel of navigator had yet touched, and of which the Christendom of that hour knew nothing. But the man who had been chosen as the instrument to lead the nations out of their prison house was meanwhile shut up in the same doleful captivity, and needed first of all to be himself brought out of the darkness. The story of his emancipation, his struggles to break his chain, is instructive as it is touching. Calvin is made to feel what Scripture so emphatically terms the power of darkness. The strength of the fetter, and the helplessness of the poor captive, that, remembering the gall and the wormwood, he may be touched with pity for the miseries of those he is called to liberate, and may continue to toil in patience and faith till their fetters are broken. The Reformation was in the air, and the young student could hardly breathe without inhaling somewhat of the new life, and yet he seemed tolerably secure against catching the infection. He was doubly, trebly armed. In the first place, he lived in the orthodox atmosphere of the Montague. He was not likely to hear anything there to corrupt his faith. Secondly, his head had been shorn. Thus he stood at the plough of Rome, and would he now turn back? Then again, his daily food were the schoolmen, the soundly nutritious qualities of those doctrines no one in the Montague questioned. Over and above his daily and hourly lessons, the young scholar fortified himself against the approaches of heresy by the rigid observance of all outward rites. True, he had a mind squarely keen, penetrating, and inquisitive, but this did not much help the matter. For when a mind of that cast takes hold of a system like the papacy, it is with a tenacity that refuses again to let go. The intellect finds both pleasure and pride in the congenial work of framing arguments for the defense of error, till at last it becomes the dupe of its own subtlety. This was the issue to which the young Calvin was now tending. Every day his mind was becoming more one-sided. Every day he contemplated the papacy more and more, not as it was in fact, but as idealized and fashioned in his own mind. A few years more, and his whole thinking, reasoning, and feeling would have been intertwined and identified with the system. Every avenue would have been closed and barred against light, and Calvin would have become the ablest champion that ever enrolled himself in the ranks of the Roman Church. We should, at this day, have heard much more of Calvin than of Bellarmine. But God had provided an opening for the arrow to enter in the triple armor in which the young student was encasing himself. Calvin's cousin, Olivetan, a disciple of Lefebvre's, now came to Paris. Living in the same city, the cousins were frequently in each other's company, and the new opinions which were agitating Paris and beginning to find confessors in the Place de Grève became a topic of frequent converse between them. Nay, it is highly probable that Calvin had witnessed some of the martyrdoms we have narrated in that previous chapter. The great bell of Notre Dame had summoned all to Paris, and why not Calvin? To see how the young pavane and the hermit of livery could stand with looks undismayed at the stake. Olivetan and Calvin are not of one mind on the point, and the debates wax warm. Olivetan boldly assails, and Calvin as boldly defends the dogmas of the Church. In the closet there is a great battlefield, but there are two combatants before us, it is true, but on the conflict there hang issues far more momentous than have depended on many great battles in which numerous hosts have been engaged. In this humble apartment the old and the new times have met. They struggle the one with the other, and as victory shall incline, so will the new day rise or fade in Christendom. If Olivetan shall be worsted and bound again to the chariot wheel of an infallible church, the world will never see that beautiful version of the New Testament in the vernacular of France, which is destined to accomplish so much in the way of diffusing the light. But if Calvin shall lower his sword before his cousin and yield himself up to the arguments of Lefebvre's disciple, what a blow to Rome! The scholar in whose sharp dialectic weapon her representatives in Paris have begun to lean in prospect of coming conflict will pass over to the camp of the enemy to lay his brilliant genius and vast acquirements at the feet of Protestantism. The contest between the two cousins is renewed day by day. These are the battles that change the world. Not those noisy affairs that are fought with cannons and sabers, but those in which souls wrestle to establish or overthrow great principles. There are but two religions in the world. We hear Olivetan say, the one class of religions are those which men have invented, in all of which man saves himself by ceremonies and good works. The other is that one religion which is revealed in the Bible, and which teaches man to look for salvation solely from the free grace of God. I will have none of your new doctrines, Calvin sharply rejoins. Think you that I have lived in error all my days? But Calvin is not as sure of the matter as he seems. The words of his cousin have gone deeper into his heart than he is willing to admit even to himself. And when Olivetan has taken farewell for this day, scarce has the door been closed behind him when Calvin, bursting into tears, falls upon his knees and gives vent in prayer to the doubts and anxieties that agitate him. The doubts by which his soul was now shaken grew in strength with each renewed discussion. What shall he do? Shall he forsake the church? That seems to him like casting himself into the gulf of perdition. And yet, can the church save him? There is a new light breaking upon him, in which her dogmas are melting away. The ground beneath him is sinking. To what shall he cling? His agitation grew anon into a great tempest. He felt within him the sorrows of death, and his closet resounded with sighs and groans, as did Luther's at Erfurt. This tempest was not in the intellect, though doubtless the darkness of his understanding had to do with it. Its seat was the soul, the conscience. It consisted in a sense of guilt, a consciousness of vileness, and a shuddering apprehension of wrath. So long as he had to do merely with the saints, creatures like himself, only a little holier it might be, it was all well. But now he was standing in the presence of that infinitely holy one, with whom evil cannot dwell. He was standing there. The blackness and vileness of his sin shone in the clear light of the divine purity. He was standing there, the transgressor of a law that says, "The soul that sinneth shall die." That death, how awful! Yet that award, how righteous! He was standing there, with all in which he had formerly trusted, saints, rights, good works, swept clean away, with nothing to protect him from the arm of the lawgiver. He had to come to a judge without an advocate. It did not occur to him before that he needed an advocate, at least other than Rome provides, because before he saw neither God's holiness nor his own guilt. But now he saw both. The struggle of Calvin was not the perplexity of the skeptic unable to make up his mind among conflicting systems. It was the agony of a soul fleeing from death, but seeing as yet no way of escape. It was not the conflict of the intellect, which had broken loose from truth, and is tossed on the billows of doubt and unbelief, a painful spectacle, and one of not infrequent occurrence in our century. Calvin's struggle was not of this sort. It was the strong wrestling of a man who had firm hold of the great truths of divine revelation, although not as yet of all these truths, and who saw the terrible realities which they brought him face to face with, and who comprehended the dreadful state of his case, fixed for him by his own transgressions on the one hand, and the irrevocable laws of the divine character and government on the other. A struggle, this, of a much more terrific kind than any mere intellectual one, and of this latter sort was the earnestness of the 16th century, not knowing as yet that there is forgiveness with God, because as yet he did not believe in the atonement through which there cometh a free forgiveness. Calvin at this hour stood looking into the blackness of eternal darkness. Had he doubted, that doubt would have mitigated his pain, but he did not and could not doubt. He saw too surely the terrible reality, and knew not how it was to be avoided. Here was himself a transgressor. There was the law awarding death, and there was the judge ready, nay, bound, to inflict it. So Calvin felt. The serenity of Calvin's struggle was in proportion to the strength of his self-righteousness. That principle had been growing within him from his youth upwards. The very blamelessness of his life, and the punctuality with which he discharged all of the acts of devotion, had helped to nourish it into vigor and strength, and now nothing but a tempest of surpassing force could have beaten down and laid in the dust a pride which had been waxing higher and stronger with every rite he performed, and every year that passed over him. And till his pride had been laid in the dust, it was impossible that he could throw himself at the feet of the great physician. But meanwhile, like King Joram, he went to physicians who could not heal him of his disease. Mere empires they were, who gave him beads to count and relics to kiss, instead of the death that atones and the blood that cleanses. Confess, cried the doctors of Montague, who could read in his dimmed eye and wasting form the agony that was raging in his soul, and too surely divined its cause. Confess, confess, cried they, in alarm, for they saw that they were on the point of losing their most promising pupil, on whom they had built so many hopes. Calvin went to his confessor. He told him, not all, but as much as he durst, and the father gave him kindly a few anodynes from the church's pharmacopoeia to relieve his pain. The patient strove to persuade himself that his trouble was somewhat assuaged, and then he would turn again to the schoolmen, if haply he might forget. In the interest awakened by their subtleties and speculations, the great realities that had engrossed him. But soon there would descend on him another and fiercer burst of the tempest, and then groans louder even than before would echo through his chamber, and tears more copious than he had yet shed would water his couch. One day, while the young scholar Montague was passing through these struggles, he chanced to visit the Place de Grève, where he found a great crowd of priests, soldiers, and citizens gathered round a stake at which a disciple of the new doctrines was calmly yielding up his life. He stood till the fire had done its work, and a stake and an iron collar, chain, and a heap of ashes were the only memorials of the tragedy he had witnessed. What he had seen awakened a train of thoughts within him. These men, he said to himself, have a peace which I do not possess. They endure the fire with a rare courage. I, too, could brave the fire, but were death to come to me as it comes to them, with the sting of the church's anathema in it, could I face that as calmly as they do? Why is it that they are so courageous in the midst of terrors that are as real as they are dreadful, while I am oppressed and tremble before apprehensions and forebodings? Yes, I will take my cousin Olivetan's advice and search the Bible, if haply I may find that new way of which he speaks, and which these men who go so bravely through the fire seem to have found. He opened the book, which no one, says Rome, should open unless the church be by to interpret. He began to read, but the first effect was a sharper terror. His sins had never appeared so great, nor himself so vile as now. He would have shut the book, but to what other quarter could he turn? On every side of him an abyss appeared to be opening, so he continued to read, and by he thought he could discern dimly and afar off what seemed a cross, and one hanging upon it, and his form was like the Son of God. And he looked again, and the vision was clearer, for now he thought he could read the inscription over the head of the sufferer. He was wounded for our iniquities. He was bruised for our transgressions. The chastisement of our peace was upon him, and with his stripes we are healed. A ray now shone through the darkness. He thought he could see a way of escape, a shelter where the black tempest that lowered over him would no longer beat upon his head. Already the great burden that pressed upon him was less heavy. It seemed as if about to fall off, and now it rolled down as he kept gazing at the crucified. "Oh, Father," he burst out, it was no longer the judge, the avenger. "Oh, Father, his sacrifice has appeased thy wrath. His blood has washed away my impurities. His cross has borne my curse. His death has atoned for me." In the midst of the great billows, his feet had touched the bottom. he found the ground to be good. He was upon a rock. Calvin, however, was not yet safe on the shore and past all danger. One formidable obstacle he had yet to surmount, and one word expresses it: the church. Christ had said, "Lo, I am with you always." The church, then, was the temple of Christ. And this made unity in all ages and in all lands, one of her essential attributes. The fathers had claimed this as the mark of the true church. She must be one. They had said, precisely so. But is this unity outward and visible, or inward and spiritual? The quod semper, quod ubique, et ad omnibus, if sought in an outward realization, can be found only in the Church of Rome. How many have fallen over the stumbling block and never risen again? How many even in our own age have made shipwreck here? This was the rock on which Calvin was now in danger of shipwreck. The church rose before his eyes, a venerable and holy society. He saw her coming down from ancient times, covering all lands, embracing in her ranks the martyrs and confessors of primitive times and the great doctors of the Middle Ages, with the Pope at their head, the vicar of Jesus Christ. This seemed truly a temple of God's own building, with all of its faults, yet it was a glorious church, divine and heavenly. Must he leave this august society and join himself to a few despised disciples of the new opinions? This seemed like a razing of his name from the book of life. This was to invoke excommunication upon his own head and write against himself a sentence of exclusion from the family of God, nay, from God himself. This was the great battle that Calvin had yet to fight. How many have commenced this battle only to lose it? They have been beaten back and beaten down by the pretended divine authority of the Roman Church, by the array of her great names and her great councils, and though last, not least, by the terror of her anathemas. It is not possible for even the strongest minds all at once to throw off the spell of the great enchantress, nor would even Calvin have conquered in this sore battle had he not had recourse to the sword of the Spirit, which is the Word of God. Ever and anon he came back to the Bible. He sought for the church as she is there shown, a spiritual society, Christ her head, the Holy Spirit her life, truth her foundation, and believers her members. And in proportion as this church disclosed her beauty to him, the fictitious splendor and earthly magnificence which shone around the Church of Rome waned, and at last vanished outright. There can be no church, we hear Calvin saying to himself, where the truth is not. Here, in the Roman communion, I can find only fables, silly inventions, manifest falsehoods, and idolatrous ceremonies. The society that is founded on these things cannot be the church. If I shall come back to the truth, as contained in the Scriptures, I will not come back to the church. And will I not be joined to the holy company of prophets and apostles, and saints and martyrs? And as regards the Pope, the vicar of Jesus Christ, let me not be awed by a big word. If without warrant from the Bible, or the call of the Christian people, and lacking the holiness and humility of Christ, the Pope place himself above the church and surround himself with worldly pomp, and arrogate lordship over the faith and consciences of men, is he therefore entitled to homage? And must I bow down and do obeisance? The Pope, concluded Calvin, is but a scarecrow, dressed out in magnificence and fulminations. I will go on my way without minding him. In fine, Calvin concluded that the term church could not make the society that monopolized the term really the church. High-sounding titles and lofty assumptions could give neither unity nor authority. These could come from the truth alone, and so he abandoned the church that he might enter the church of the Bible. The victory was now complete. The last link of Rome's chain had been rent from his soul. The huge phantasmagoria, which had awed and terrified him, had been dissolved, and he stood up in the liberty wherewith Christ had made him free. Here truly was rest after a great fight, a sweet and blessed dawn after a night of thick darkness and tempest. Thus was fought one of the great battles of the world. But when one thinks of what was won for mankind upon this field, one feels its issues important beyond all calculation, and would rather have conquered upon it than have won all the victories and worn all the laurels of Caesars and Alexander. The day of Calvin's conversion is not known, but the historian de Bigny, to whose research the world is indebted for its full and exact knowledge of the event, has determined the year 1527 and the place Paris, that city where some of the saints of God had already been put to death, and where, in years to come, their blood was to be poured out like water. The day of Calvin's conversion is one of the memorable days of time. Chapter 8. Calvin becomes a student of law. Gate of the New Kingdom. Crowds pressing to enter. The few only able to do so. Lefebvre and Farel sighing for the conversion of Francis I. A greater conversion. Calvin refuses to be made a priest. Chooses the profession of law. Goes to Orleans. Pierre d'Etoile. Calvin becomes his scholar. Teaching of Etoile on the duty of the state to punish heterodoxy. Calvin among his college companions. A victory. Calvin studies Greek. Melchior Wolmar. Calvin prepared for his work as a commentator. His last mental struggle. The Reformation has come, and is setting up anew the kingdom of the gospel upon the earth, flinging wide open its portals, and stationing no sentinel on the threshold, nor putting price upon its blessings. It bids all enter. We see great multitudes coming up to the gates, and making as if they would press in and become citizens of this new state. Great scholars and learned divines are groping about the door. They are not able to become as little children, so they cannot find the gate. We see ecclesiastics of every grade crowding to that portal. There stands the purple cardinal, and there too the frocked friar, all eagerly inquiring what they may do, that they may inherit eternal life. But they cannot part with their sins or with their self-righteousness, and so they cannot enter at the gate, which, however wide, to the poor in spirit, is straight to them. Noble kings, illustrious statesmen, and powerful nations come marching up, intent seemingly on enrolling themselves among the citizens of this new society. They stand on the very threshold, another step, and all will be well. But alas, they hesitate, they falter. It is a moment of terrible suspense. What blinds them so that they cannot see the entrance? Is it a little word, a potent spell, which has called up before them an imposing image that looks the impersonation of all the ages and the embodiment of all apostolic virtues and blessings? The Church. Dazzled by this apparition, they pause, they reel backwards. The golden moment passes, and from the very gates of evangelical light they take the downward road to the old darkness. The broad pathway is filled from side to side by men whose feet have touched the very threshold of the kingdom, but who are now returning, some offended by the simplicity of the infant church, others scared by the scaffold and the stake, others held back by their love of ease and their love of sin. A few only are able to enter in and earn the crown, and even these enter only after sore fightings and great agonies of soul. It was here that the Reformation had its beginning, not in the high places of the world, amid the ambitions of thrones and of councils of cabinets. It struggled into birth in the low places of society, in closets, and the bosoms of the penitent, amid tears and strong cries and many groans. Paris was not one of those cities that were destined to be glorified by the light of Protestantism. Nevertheless, it pleased God, as narrated in the last chapter, to make it the scene of a great conversion. Lefebvre and Farel were sighing to enroll among the disciples of the gospel a great potentate, Francis I. If, thought they, the throne can be gained, will not the preponderance of the power on the side of the gospel infallibly assure its triumph in France? But God, whose thoughts are not as man's thoughts, was meanwhile working for a far greater issue, the conversion of a pale-faced student in the College of Montaigu, whose name neither Lefebvre nor Farel had ever happened to hear, and whose very existence was then unknown to them. They little dreamed what a conflict was at that very hour going on so near to them in a small chamber in an obscure quarter of Paris, and although they had known it, they could as little have conjectured that when that young scholar had bowed to the force of the truth, a mightier power would have taken its place at the side of the gospel than if Francis and all his court had become its patrons and champions. Light cannot be spread by edict of king, or by sword of soldier. It is the Bible, preached by the evangelists, and testified to by the martyr, that is to bid the gospel, like the day, shine forth and bless the earth. From the hour of Calvin's conversion, he became the center of the Reformation in France, and by the center of the Reformation in Christendom. Consequently, in tracing the several stages of his career, we are chronicling the successive developments of the great movement of Protestantism. His eyes were opened, and he saw the Church of Rome disenchanted of that elusive splendor, that pseudo-divine authority, which had aforetime dazzled and subdued him. Where formerly there stood a spiritual building, the house of God, the abode of truth, as he believed, there now rose a temple of idols. How could he minister at her altars? True, his head had been shorn, but he had not yet received that indelible character which is stamped on all who enter the priesthood, and so it was not imperative that he should proceed farther in that path. He resolved to devote himself to the profession of law. This mode of retreat from the clerical ranks would awaken no suspicion. It is somewhat remarkable that his father had come, at about the same time, to that same resolution touching the future profession of his son, and this young Calvin had his parents' full consent to his new choice, a coincidence which Beza has pointed out as a somewhat striking one. The path on which Gerard Chauvin saw his son now entering was one in which many and brilliant honors were to be won, and not one of those prizes was there which the marvelous intellect and the rare application of that son did not bid fair to gain. Already Gerard in his fancy saw him standing at the foot of the throne and guiding the destinies of France. Has Calvin then bidden a final adieu to theology? And are the courts of law and offices of state henceforth to claim him as their own? No, he has turned aside, but for a little while. that by varying the exercise of his intellect he may bring to the great work that lies before him a versatility of power, an amplitude of knowledge, and a range of sympathy not otherwise attainable. Of that work he did not at this hour so much as dream, but he who had called him from the womb and ordained him a prophet to the nations was leading him by a way he knew not.